Michael Boyle's StrengthCoach.com presents the Strength Coach Podcast, brought to you by Perform Better, the experts in functional training and rehabilitation. PerformBetter.com.
All right, hey everybody, welcome to episode 295 of the Strength Coach Podcast, the official podcast of Michael Boyle's StrengthCoach.com, the world's best source for strength and conditioning information, brought to you by Perform Better, the experts in functional training and rehabilitation. I'm your host, Anthony Renna, and the show notes are located on my site, ContinueFit.com. It's also where you can find out more about my book, Be Like the Best and the Be Like the Best workbook. Go to ContinueFit.com to check that out. All right, today on the StrengthCoach.com Coach's Corner, I spoke with Coach Boyle about a forum thread called Acceleration Strategy. It's actually a thread that was started in 2009 by Charlie Weingroff and brought up again by Miguel Salza, who wanted to talk about, he mentioned the false step or the Plyo step, as Lee Taft calls it. And, you know, if they're doing that, if our athletes are doing that, should we coach the athletes out of it? So we went into a lot of detail and kind of took a couple different directions with that. There was a really good, it was such a good forum thread with a lot of great responses and videos on it. So if you're not a member of StrengthCoach.com, you got to check that out. For the TrainHeroic data-driven coaching session, Tim Robinson and Adam Dawdy discuss some best practices for online training. Want to keep continuing to talk to you guys about online training and what are the best ways to approach this. Not that easy. Just a reminder, Coach Boyle and I both use TrainHeroic to deliver all of our online training, and we've been blown away by their service and how it allows us to connect with our athletes. It's super easy to use. They just launched plans that start as low as $10 a month, depending on how many people you have, and they have a free 14-day trial. So if you mention that we sent you, they're going to put a 4-week athlete development program in your account absolutely free. So if you're coach looking for the best online training solution in the game, go to TrainHeroic.com, take the free 14-day trial. All right, for the functional movement system segment, Gray Cook continues his 3-part series. This is part 2 on readiness. For the BodyByBoyleOnline.com Hit the Gym with the Strength Coach segment, I have on Rocky Snyder, and Rocky was one of the presenters at the Perform Better Summer Series, and he did Understanding Gait and Posture for Better Program Design. I wasn't able to catch that. That's why I'm excited about the app coming out, but we did talk all about gait. We talked a lot about pronation mechanics and supination mechanics and really looking at the total body when we look at gait and posture. I think Rocky really does a great job kind of breaking this stuff down. It's complicated and there's a lot to it, but I think he does a great job with this. So lots of things to get to. So let's get on the phone with Coach Boyle. All right, now it's time for the StrengthCoach.com Coach's Corner with Coach Boyle. StrengthCoach.com, the world's best source for strength conditioning information. Try it out. 30 days. We extended the trial. 30 days for just $1. We extended it again because we said until all gyms are open. California, still some gyms closed, scattered around the country. So 30 days, just $1. Access to all the articles, videos, and programs, as well as the best forum on the net. It's the only place to have full access to Coach Boyle. He's on every day. Check it out at StrengthCoach.com. Coach, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Ann. How are you?
Hanging in. You know.
What's the New York gym situation right now? Are they open inside now?
Yeah, 25% capacity supposedly, and masks. You know, under the full restrictions, you had to get. New York City's different. They're just starting to, but it's like a health department / building department inspection, which is kind of a joke. Because the building inspector came to one gym at my buddy's gym Evolve downstairs. They were great, and they were just like, look, we don't really know what we're doing, and you know they have to show them that the air conditioner has a certain filter that I forget the name of it right now, MERV 14 or 13 or something, and then they have to have documentation that they had it, and they have to have all the signs. They want all the signs, and they want everybody wearing a mask, you know, the clients included. So that's the restriction right now. And you know, gyms are just really happy to be open and doing anything. And some are thriving because nobody wants to go to an Equinox type gym. Not nobody, but a lot of people are afraid of that. So some of these semi-privates they're increasing their semi-privates because there's a couple gyms like like Varsity House, who those guys have a big place like you, and people are comfortable to know they could still put in a good amount of people paying $400, $500 a month, 15 people at a time in that gym and feel good and feel safe. So those guys are killing it because they have the space. Or it's even the smaller places are killing it too because they're, people know, hey, nobody's in here. Great. Kind of like what you said about, and I love this idea. I'm telling everybody about this idea about, like the shopping, like the supermarket type idea. Hey, seniors only from 6:30 to 7:30. You were talking about doing that in the middle of the day. So I think people, even if it's just what you talked about, Corona theater, it does work and people feel safer in that environment.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, it's, you just want to keep wiping stuff down and have everybody, all our staff has masks. Because of the way we're set up, we're not making them work out in masks once they're in their pod. Because, I think it's ridiculous that, if you're clearly more than 6 feet away from somebody, when in a 14-foot space. And people have been very good. We've done well. We're back better than I thought we would be. I looked at some numbers this month, and August was actually surprisingly good in spite of us not having a great summer. And September, because we're only basically 8 per group here, we're almost, at like after school, we're getting close to our capacity. So it's good.
Nice. My buddy TJ Lopez from AMP in Long Island, he had almost as good of an August as 2019, and September is looking like it will surpass last September. The only asterisk here is he's working, kind of going back to this E-Myth idea where you're seeing a lot of owners who have had to make, cut costs, et cetera, and they're going back to probably, being the technician a little bit more. So that's the only rub, but it's temporary. And I think most trainers are not afraid to work, so it's fine. But yeah, that's the situation right now.
Yeah, and that's the same with me. I'm probably here more than I have been in the past, making sure that everything's going the way that we want it to go. Because obviously our goal is to get back to sort of our pre-shutdown revenue numbers. And as I said, I think we can do that. And I do think, and I've said this to you before, I honestly think our product will be better when we're done than it was before we started.
I love that. Yeah, I love that attitude. And let's be honest, though, you're only there more because it's summer's over. You shut down the summer house. So please don't act like you're trying to work hard. Coach, I couldn't believe it. We had on the StrengthCoach.com forum a thread from 2009. Charlie Weingraf actually started called Acceleration Strategy. And it was talking about the plyo step, and Miguel Salza brought it back up. Casey Wheel, who's still a member, was throwing in some great stuff in there, and Dinny Wong as well. And you guys I thought it was a great, it really is a good discussion. I think I need to put it into the best of category now because there's some really good stuff. And really, Miguel he said the question is not, should we teach the false step, quote, or slash plyo step, but should we correct the athletes that do it? And I think, with you and doing fly-in tens, it's really not an issue from the perspective of timing with the fly-in 10 because, there's no movement and you're already moving and that's what you're timing. And I love what you said about this. This does not apply to reactive agility or game situations. I don't want to coach guys on how to react. That seems counterintuitive. The idea of reaction is that you're not thinking about what you do, you're reacting. And people who espouse reactive agility to you, that just duplicates practice. Can you just go over this long argued theory on the plyo step, and should we correct it if we see him doing it?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think Lee Taft was the one who initially labeled it plyo step versus false step. He said, years ago, he said, I don't think it's a false step. I think it's a plyo step. It's sort of kind of like, might be like our rock in the clean, where you think, what are they doing? There's a little weight shift to get the bar moving. And I think the problem, and this is what the thread I think did really well, was defining the context or contexts of the situation in terms of when are we really talking about? If we're talking about, are we talking about timing somebody in a speed drill? Or because again, if you said to me, even in a 5-10-5, I want the fastest 5-10-5, then I don't want a weight shift. I do not want a counter shift. I don't want, if I'm timing based on first movement, then I don't want that first movement going in the wrong direction. Some people will say that still produces a faster time. And again, this was my point. I don't believe that. I don't believe when you know where your intent is to go, then the way to get there probably is to use the segment that's closest. And, it's like, you wouldn't, if you're doing a 3-point stance, 40-yard dash, you're not going to start by shifting front foot to back foot to front foot to get yourself going like you would in that kind of plyo step or false step. But in agility situations, everybody's, like you said, everybody's into reactive agility. You're probably going to see a lot of that. I think I get that we want to teach movement. I understand that part. And I think that was a big thing that I learned in sort of my early athletes performance interactions when I started to watch, Mark and, and Craig Friedman and a lot of these guys, talking about teaching movement and looking at knee angles and shin angles and where your feet are and all that stuff. But I also think in general, most people are getting too much of that during the course of the week. So do we really want to take our time, when we've got, in my mind, a finite period? Let's say, like I always keep going back to the idea, right now we have 60 minutes twice a week. If I get kids that I'm getting for 60 minutes twice a week who are getting 3 practices and 2 games in addition to the 2 hours with me, I don't think I want to spend time teaching movement because I don't think that's efficient use of time. I think there's other big buckets, other low-hanging fruit that I can address that are going to have much more impact on that person's ability to play the game. So all of that got covered. Deanie made a really good point in his, he was talking, actually, he was relating it to martial arts and, added in some Bruce Lee video. And so, I think there's some validity on both sides. Casey has some really cool stuff that he's doing. But I think sometimes what can happen is that, it gets back to like the Bud Light chocolate chip ice cream thing. And it's like, I really like teaching movement, so I'm going to do it. And I look at it and think, you may really like teaching movement, but is it the most efficient use of the 120 minutes that you have during the week if it takes away from, linear speed or power or, strength or whatever it is? I feel like we're jamming to get all the stuff in that we need to get in and to spend a lot of time. The other thing, and long answer to short question, but when you start looking at, you need a really receptive audience to really teach movement. When you start talking about some of this stuff, really detailed to explain to people, it's kind of like, people show like the base stealing analogy, where your foot is going to be and, where your weight is going to be and, how you're going to step and all that stuff. If you just have the average team sport athlete, they're probably not going to focus enough for what you're doing to really have super high value anyway.
Yeah, I really liked Casey's responses from the respect of he kind of was picking out different situations where it might be good and others where it wouldn't, different positions in different sports. So you're right, though. It was you guys had a really good discussion going back and forth. Coach, can you just, I would think, can you tell me if I'm right? Well, like Lee probably called it the plyo step just because he was trying to use the analogy of like the plyo and the, taking advantage of the stretch shortening cycle, right? So I would think that's kind of where he was doing, like, hey, it's like a plyo where you're taking advantage of this and you're getting a more explosive start.
Yeah, and I also think he was trying to remove the negative connotation of false step.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you hear false steps, like, oh, he took a false step, he went backward to go forward kind of thing. Some people would look at that and think that would be, that's a negative. And I think by renaming it plyo step, it makes it sound like it's a positive thing. And I think that was really also the direction that he was going in. And as I said, I get it. I just would say, it's sort of like if you had the survey, somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, strongly agree. I'm probably like in that middle. I'd probably give it a 3 on the scale and say, I somewhat agree.
Yeah.
I kind of get it. I don't strongly agree, and I don't strongly disagree.
Yeah.
So it's I usually don't have neutral positions, as you well know, but I would say I tend to fall in the middle here and can see where this stuff could be helpful. But I do really believe, particularly looking at like watching lacrosse, because that's what I'm watching now, and watching dodging. I think you learn dodging by dodging, and I think there's a lot of things that and I think it's the same thing. It's like trying to teach somebody, to be like Kyrie Irving instinctively in basketball. It's like the hokey pokey. Put your right foot in, put your left foot out. You know what I mean? Like that. I don't know if you can really teach that. I think that's something maybe that's developed more than it's taught, and it's developed by being in that consistent situation. Because a lot of times what you're really doing is looking at what your opponent is doing and looking at what their feet are doing and looking at the reaction to, well, what did my jab step do to their, defensive shuffle? Did they react to that jab or did they not? And if they didn't, maybe I'm going to run right by them. And if they did, maybe I'm going to cross over and go the other way. Or in lacrosse, I'm going to switch hands and go the other way. So I don't know. I think it may be a little bit of wishful thinking. And then the other thing that I always get back to is that if you don't have the breaks, if you don't have the eccentric strength, if you're not doing your kind of, your not, I guess it would call it plyometric, but really your eccentric landing skill, your single leg hops and single leg bounds and those things, if you're underpowered, no amount of teaching is going to make you a good direction changer. I always feel like single leg strength is what's going to make you a good direction changer. When I look at a guy like Barry Sanders, there's a reason he could stop on a dime like he could and get back going the other way. And the major reason is incredible single leg strength. I don't know necessarily if he did lots of single leg work or if he could do a great single leg squat, but I would bet pretty quickly if I'd trained Barry Sanders, I'll bet you that he would have crushed single leg squats within a couple of weeks with a lot of load, because he had an incredible system of brake and acceleration. And that's really what direction change is about. And I think I said this another time when we were talking. When we think about direction change or plyometric or whatever it is, it's an eccentric contraction that eventually becomes isometric. So you eventually stop the motion, and then you've got to create concentric going back the other way. You need a certain requisite level of eccentric, whatever, strength, power, stopping ability to be able to make that happen. And you need a certain level of concentric strength, power, propulsive ability to make that happen. And no matter how much you think or talk to somebody about what they're doing, it's still going to come down to a function of kind of body weight times speed. Okay, how fast am I moving and how much do I weigh? And then how much braking force do I need to create to get myself going in the other direction?
Yeah, it's funny. When you were talking about reactive agility too, it reminded me of the old Wayne Gretzky idea. Like his dad used to put 100 pucks out in the backyard and set up the cones and just say, "Listen, here, you got to score 100 goals. There's no goalie, but you got to your only requirement, one requirement, just do it different every single time." That's where the creativity comes from. Those kind of things, not this planned type
exactly.
of
It's funny. My friend Jamie Monroe that I've been doing stuff with in the lacrosse world is just a huge free play advocate. He advocates, 3-on-3 with tennis balls with no equipment. So you've got no gloves, you've got no helmet, you've got a tennis ball, and it's all kind of read and react stuff. And he encourages, I want behind the back passes, I want behind the back shots, because he's trying to make people as creative as he possibly can. And so I think there's a lot of room in these areas, but I think sometimes we want to make everything kind of teachable and create progressions. And obviously that's what we do. That's CFSC. But I'm just not sure from a movement standpoint if that stuff really matters if you sort of don't meet the requisite requirements.
Yeah, it also reminds me of what you just talked about too. Is the talent code and the guys in Brazil playing, and they didn't have the real estate, so they were playing those games, in a tight space on basketball courts, for example, or I forget what it was specifically, and that's where
it was futsal.
Futsal, okay, that's what they call it. That's right.
Yeah.
Same idea.
If you look at so many of the great ones have developed in those kind of playground situations. It's kind of like, they always like Mark and his friends will always talk about, I broke that guy's ankles. You know what I mean? Like that's what you want. You want ankle breaking cuts, where you can shake the guy and boom, that guy goes the other way and you run by him. But I watched a drill the other day. I watched something on Instagram, a lacrosse drill. And it was a guy like dancing around a bunch of cones. Well, dancing around a bunch of cones is great, with your stick. But the harsh reality is that, you need a cone that's moving. You need somebody that's reacting to what you do for it to, and also has a stick in their hand who's trying to whack your stick out of your hand to really make this thing game-like. So I don't know. We could, like I said, it's a really, people, if you're a member and you're on, it's a really good thread. It'll get you thinking. I'd love to see people. I love when these old ones get reactivated, when somebody just pops up and says, what about this? And Miguel's really good for that. Miguel,
he is.
He's great, and he's a thinker, which I really like. I mean, that's for me a big compliment, because he'll always be questioning things. And sometimes I tell him, I think you're overthinking this. But he does think, and I think that sounds redundant. But that's what you need to do. You need to, and that goes back, like I did a speed webinar with Pat Beath yesterday, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing from a speed standpoint if I didn't question what I was doing before, if I didn't read Tony Holler's stuff and say, And obviously we published a bunch of Tony stuff on the site, but you get into that situation of saying, hey, this guy disagrees with me and strongly disagrees with me, but I need to analyze this a little bit and ask myself, why is he so strongly disagreeing with what I think? And I would say, like in his case, I came around to his way of thinking about recording, ranking, that kind of thing, and timing. I didn't come around to his way of thinking about the weight room. But the key is to be able to listen, and listen without reacting. Listen, I didn't immediately tweet back at Tony that, oh, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. It was more, let me Google this guy's name. Let me find more articles. Let me read. Let me try to understand. You go back to 7 Habits, right? Seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I think that's a really important thing, that you shouldn't be arguing until you understand what you're arguing about, what the other person is actually saying, versus maybe what you think they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like it because I think it challenges you. I think when those guys do that and they're showing videos, and people like Casey and Denny and Miguel are just throwing all this stuff out there, I think it gets you, that's what we want. That's what makes the site go too, is when you're starting to think and agreeing and disagreeing, and it's all good stuff. So the magic happens on the forum, I like to say. So Coach, thanks for coming on, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, thanks, Dan. I got to get out. I got a 12 o'clock group, so I got to get back to work. God.
You're a technician, man. All right, guys, right now at Perform Better, it is free shipping for orders over $49, so make sure you take advantage of that. And if you missed the summer speaker series, the Perform Better app is coming out soon, and all the recordings will be on there, so it's going to be really cool. Stay tuned for that. Also, they're going to be doing a fall speaker series, and they're going to have some new speakers, people that have never spoken on the Perform Better tour. So make sure you check out performbetter.com, get on their email list so you stay alert to when that's going to happen. Check it out at performbetter.com.
Hey, this is Adam.
This is Tim.
Welcome to the TrainHeroic Data-Driven Coaching segment.
Let's go.
Today, Tim and I are going to talk a bit about best practices for online or remote coaching.
Yeah.
And today we're going to focus on distinguishing between coaching and programming, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to let Tim take it from here.
Yeah. And this is something coaches, I think, when they're jumping into online training or remote coaching for the first time, they really need to hone in on this distinction. And Adam, you said it. The first thing is programming. Creating a program is kind of like setting up the X's and the O's for training, right? Essentially what you could do is create a program, send it off to someone, and let them kind of control it, run it. They will see that programming. They'll have the X's and O's. And if they're an adept athlete, they could execute that thing pretty much with good efficiency, or proficiency if they're a really good athlete.
Yeah, for sure. So let's not lose that point, which is that, yeah, totally agree. There are plenty of people who've downloaded, who bought programs on the internet and they've run them and they've had success. There are plenty more who either didn't finish the thing, they got hurt, they needed to adjust and didn't know how, and they got derailed for a week and were like, I don't know, do I restart or do I keep going? What do I do now?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's really, go ahead.
There are definitely some successes out there, but among all the actual successes, there are a lot of people who did not.
Yeah, exactly right. So people are going to, if you just hand someone, let's say, a PDF now on TrainHeroic, we've got a nifty app which gives folks the ability to kind of alter and adjust things if they need to. But let's just stick with the example of programming. Simply, if you give someone a PDF and let's say that high school athlete has a lingering knee injury or doesn't have the equipment or the space to do something, they're going to go right to Google. I'm telling you now, they're going to go right to Google and they're going to search and they're going to find some whatever is floating out there in the internet for them to alter, create an exercise variation there or do something different. What they're really looking for, Adam, is guidance, right? They're looking for coaching. Most of these folks aren't going to know what to do when something goes awry, okay? And that's where the coach really needs to make that distinction between, all right, if I send, this is a program, the athlete can do it, against coaching, which is now I'm going to help this athlete along their journey. I know they're going to have questions. I know they're going to need some exercise variation. I know they're going to need some motivation at some point. That's the difference. It's in the communication.
And you just said it, which is like, when you buy a program or something and you're like, well, 6 weeks, I guess I better hit every session as planned. Yeah. Or halfway through, I'm going to be like in a place where I actually don't know if I'm going to make it, right? Especially if like the weight progressions are planned on percentages, have these really technical programs like, I don't know. Am I going to succeed or is it in week 4, the weight's going to crush me?
Right. No, exactly. And that's where the coaching comes into play. And for us at TrainHeroic, we differentiate those things very simply. We have programs and we have teams. Teams are your coaching, right? That's where people are going to jump in. They're going to follow the training and you're going to be there to kind of give them a lift when they need a lift. And I think for me, that's the most important thing when you are hundreds of miles, thousands of miles away from someone, is still being able to give them the feeling that you're there, that you're coaching them, that there's a community behind them, which is, what we in TrainHeroic encourage on our teams. But it's really about how that coach is going to guide you through your journey. So when you're starting out on this thing as a coach, you have to make the decision, right? What do my athletes need? And how am I going to help them the best? Is it providing the X's and the O's, or is it jumping in and really, kind of bolstering this community and creating this system of feedback where you can really help these folks?
Yeah, I'm going to use an example here. It's like, we have, California Strength is one of our big marketplace sellers, and
sure,
they certainly have their teams, and some of those teams are for experts, and some of them are for people who are just starting weightlifting.
Right.
And they have programs, and like, for sure, there are lots of people who buy these like very specific programs, like peak for competition or something.
Yeah.
And those people are pretty knowledgeable and go execute that thing for sure.
Right.
As you like lose levels of like knowledge and like experience, the more likely it is that you're like, man, I actually need like a little help more often than just like doing the thing, as written all the time, kind of thing. So I think it definitely depends on the athlete's psychology and experience and all that. But the thing about those teams that's awesome is like, I see these communities is that like half the time the coach doesn't actually do anything.
Yeah.
It's like this group is like, they post a video and like somebody come, the feedback's given already because you've trained your community how, what to look for. They look for it. They give the feedback you would give anyway, probably.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, or, they lift each other when it's like, hey man, I need an exercise substitution, and people can usually give good recommendations there. It's like, it's a trusted group that you can like rely on.
You got it. My last pro tip is just nothing has changed. Be authentically you as a coach and let those people feel it if you're leaning towards the coaching side against programming.
All right. So I'd wrap it up and say, a program is just a part of training, of coaching, right?
Yeah.
And that coaching is all the other services and help you give on top of that. And they're big value adds, and they help keep people with you and help get people better results.
Love it.
That's going to do it for us today. Go to trainheroic.com, start a 14-day free trial. We've got new pricing in there, starting as low as $9.99 to accommodate any kind of coach. I hope you get started today.
Hey, welcome to the Functional Movement Systems segment. My name is Gray Cook, and this is part 2, State of Readiness, where before I talked about some of those things I was bringing back into my personal life just to make sure that I was doing what I was telling other people to do. But if we take a deeper dive, is coaches into state of readiness, you've got to have that thing you lean on, and we've all got tests. I've always trusted movement more than history. What I mean by that is you can tell me about your workout, or I've got a few sample moves that will tell me if your workout is serving the most fundamental part of your performance, which is your basic mobility, motor control or stability, and proprioceptive awareness. So your ability to be aware of yourself means that I can ask you about your state of readiness, and then I can measure it. Now, if I've had a history of movement and balance test with you, we can measure those. But I hear what everybody says, time consuming. I use a abbreviated version of the Y balance called the motor control screen for the lower body. And it's basically a little slide box on an FMS kit. But I tell you what, it's very hard for people with bad balance to cheat balance. 50% of the reason a lot of people have bad balance in single leg stance is a dorsiflexion mobility problem. And the people who don't have that mobility problem have no excuse but poor motor control. So if you do have a dorsiflexion mobility problem, you've reduced the triplanar way that your body will automatically stabilize. And therefore, we've got to investigate mobility before we can really start expecting your motor control to get better. So in a lower body motor control, you basically do a partial pistol, just slide that box out. And a lot of people have seen that test and done that test. And that's sort of my own little way of doing test retest, because I look at it for state of readiness. But if I do something like a very intensive back treatment that involves maybe manipulation or dry needling, I will immediately revisit that single leg stance test, especially if it was dysfunctional, to see if I modulated the system. And I don't always make the system better. If I make it worse, I want to know about that too. So I'll realize if the central nervous system liked what we did. Heart rate variability works very good as a state of readiness, but once exercise, activity, or competition starts, once the coaching starts, heart rate variability can be all over the place. But if they show up and they're already too sympathetic, they will pre-fatigue, have poor proprioception, and probably not be able to focus or self-manage in a way that will allow them to benefit from the stress the situation's getting ready to drop on them, ready or not. So I've always encouraged professionals to understand that state of readiness. Now, if you've never met the person before, that's where I sort of stick to my guns and say, listen, I'm gonna steal 25 minutes of your life with a movement screen, some balance tests, and a few historical questions. And I'm going to aim more than I shoot in the beginning of this, but once I got that baseline, everything that goes up or down against that baseline can help inform your state of readiness. If we're doing that plus a lifestyle advice where we've got some sleep and wake information and some heart rate variability or something, then I've pretty much got you dialed in. And I want you guys to lean into that, because when we are dealing with the athlete or the client that's not managing their lifestyle right, and we're trying to fix their mobility, stability, proprioception, movement awareness problems with movement, you got to realize you're dropping a seed of information, exercise, and experience on some pretty unfertile soil to grow anything. Remember, if you're teaching somebody in the middle of a panic attack, they're not going to retain much of the lesson plan. And if they're nodding off, they're not going to retain much of the lesson plan. And I just described both ends of the parasympathetic sympathetic balance. I don't need you nodding off, and I also don't need you freaking out. But sometimes you show up that way. So that begs the question, do we just go on with the exercise today, or do I have some default go-to defrag moves that don't require a lot of mental effort, but do sort of let you blow off some of that tension and energy that's probably getting in the way of your next best coaching session? So I'm going to go into the next segment that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to give you a few little secrets that we do to sort of wash that tension off of people. And there's two ways to play it depending on what indicator you're looking at. Well, thanks for joining me this time. And the next time I talk, it'll be part 3 on state of readiness. And I'm going to give you guys something you can do about it. between now and then, think about how you apply state of readiness personally to your own personal performance, how you're going to apply it for other people, and maybe some of the things we can do to sort of recalibrate that on the fly. This is Greg Cook for the Functional Movement Systems segment. Thanks, guys.
All right, now it's time for the BodyByBoyleOnline.com. Hit the gym with the strength coach segment. Become an insider to Mike Boyle Strength Conditioning with staff meetings, in-services, and complete access to the MBSC programs. Guys, check that out at BodyByBoyleOnline.com. All right, today I have on another Perform Better presenter, Rocky Snyder. He's a certified strength conditioning specialist, nationally recognized expert in human movement, 30 years of professional experience. He's trained thousands of clients ranging from grandparents to professional athletes and Olympic champions. Aside from owning and operating his own training studio in Santa Cruz, California, he travels far and wide, providing educational workshops to trainers, therapists, chiropractors, and physical therapists. He's got a couple books out, and the latest one is Return to Center: Strength Training to Realign the Body, Recover from Pain, and Achieve Optimal Performance. His talk this year, and we're going to get into this, was Understanding Gait and Posture for Better Program Design. So, Rocky, thanks for doing this.
Anthony, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, always cool to get a guy who people think is probably some surfer dude from Santa Cruz, who's actually from Boston.
I know. I am the greatest surfer from Reading, Massachusetts to ever touch the planet.
There you go.
At least I like to hope so.
Yeah. Well, obviously you don't have a, you didn't go up to New Hampshire every at summers to surf, right? Did you start surfing when you were in Santa Cruz?
It's like you're psychic. No, I started body surfing at the wall at Hampton Beach because that's where we spent our summers.
Yeah.
I worked up at the club casino area, and then we just spend every day over at the North Beach just body surfing. It wasn't until I came out to Santa Cruz that I actually put a board under my body. And fortunately, these days when I travel back to the East Coast, I leave a board there these days and head over to see Dave at Cinnamon Rainbows, like the surf shop right there at the wall, and get a little beach break. So yeah, you can't get the Pats fan or the Sox fan out of me, just like you can't get surf out of me these days. So
kind of sounds like we got the accent
of both worlds.
We kind of got the accent.
Well, yeah. Sorry, I just got to. Yeah, I love New England. The accent, I left there. And enough said about that.
All right. Well, I'm really interested I wasn't able to watch your presentation, and I was hoping that they were going to release the presentations a little sooner at Perform Better, but they haven't done that yet. Again, it was Understanding Gait and Posture for Better Program Design. And I was talking to you earlier, I think gait is one of those things where it's kind of this area where we've tried to get into a little bit as trainers, and I think there's plenty of room. We don't need to be a therapist to at least check on gait, check on the feet. I know I was telling you Titleist in, I think, level 2 or possibly level 3. They do talk a lot about looking at the feet, taking some pictures from behind, seeing where the foot pressure looks. In golf, they do have a lot of force plate work that they do within the swing. But it's always been something where I tried to get into a little bit, and then it's definitely, there's an art to this. But I definitely want to talk to you about, give us an overview of understanding gait first before we get into posture.
Sure. So, okay, gait. Historically, we've been doing it for 1 to 2 million years, right? Humans have been on both feet, finding their way across the plains for food. And in that time, the brain's going to try and do the most efficient job of getting that body from one point to the next. So gait is something that has been hardwired into our neurological system for eons. And with that, there is a very efficient way of moving more than any other way. And so that is the gait cycle. Now, it's complex. I'm not going to deny that. We've got 206 bones, and where they meet, they form joints. So there's 360 of those, and then those are surrounded by 630 some odd muscles, and you got to move those in all 3 planes of motion through an entire cycle that lasts 0.6 to 0.85 seconds. I mean, that's just freaking overwhelming just to think about. That is so much information to try and take in a span of less than a second, that I can easily see why it is so overwhelming for professionals to consider gait as an assessment tool, because there's so many things going on. But we can boil it down. We can really make it a lot more manageable to understand, because through gait, the body has to create certain shapes. And those shapes are based on the shape of our bones and the joint structure that they're creating. And there's only so many ways you can move the pelvis. There's only so many ways you can move the ribs and so on. And the spine can only move in so many directions too. So when you start to break down the gait cycle, you begin to see these relationships that occur and these shapes that take place. And if we really want to boil it down, there's 8 basic shapes. There's 2 in the frontal plane. 4 in the frontal plane, I'll say, left and right if you add them up. And there's a couple in the sagittal plane, a couple in the transverse plane. But let's boil it down even further. We've got 2 ways in which we move. And basically, we're either landing on the planet or we're driving off of the planet. And when we land on the planet, we want to absorb the impact in what we call pronation. The foot should absorb impact, but so should the knee and the hip and the spine and the skull and the scapula. Everything absorbs, and all the tissue around it absorbs the impact that we make when we land. And then the opposite, the exact opposite, is going to occur in order for us to propel ourselves off the planet. And we call that supination. So if we really want to boil it down to its simplest form, we can look at what the pronation mechanics of the entire body involve and what are the supination mechanics involved. And that's where we go. So I use gait as a means of assessing the quality of somebody's movement, and I combine it with posture to give me a more complete understanding. And then I can take that information and find out what joints aren't doing what they should be doing in a certain amount of time, kind of like TPI does with their golf swing analysis or their movement screening, or the FMS does to some degree. And then that gives me information that I need to say, oh, well, they're not really supinating really well here in their knee or in their hip. What kind of movements can I be doing in the gym, whether it's traditional or non-traditional strength training or flexibility work or whatever the case is, to give them that experience, so that the workouts are not going to be based on just how much can they lift in terms of gross force production or how beautiful their biceps are when it comes to beach season, but really how is the body going to move athletically as well as daily? And that's essentially it. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Well, we obviously, there's a lot to still unpack there in terms of, you broke it down, pronation mechanics, supination mechanics, and really what I really kind of jumped at when I heard you talking was sometimes we're not supinating or pronating in the knee or in the hip. So kind of, I had that question on my mind a little bit, was a lot of times we're trying to determine, is it going on at the foot or is it going on somewhere else? So can you just kind of go a little bit deeper on pronation mechanics and supination mechanics and really what you're looking for there?
All right, cool. So let's deal with pronation first. That is when we are the most loaded, where our muscles, most of them are in an eccentric loaded position to decelerate our mass against the momentum that we've just generated, and it is trying to stop against the planet. So this is where we are the most loaded. And unfortunately, it's where we don't train the most either. We're much more interested in concentric movement than eccentric loading, but we can get to that also. Let's talk about pronation. So we always think about pronation in regards to the foot. But when the foot pronates, that's when you get all 3 arches to just subtly drop and to mold into whatever environment it's landing on. So, and I say 3 arches because each foot, you've got the medial arch on the inside that everyone thinks about. Then you got a shallower arch on the outside edge of your foot called the lateral arch. And then the roof of your foot creates an arch too. We call that the transverse arch. And all 3 should splay outward so that the bones are kind of traveling apart, at least in the plantar surface on the bottom of the foot. And all that tissue is getting lengthened and loaded, ready to spring back up like a kid just bouncing down on a trampoline moments before they go in the opposite direction. But the ankle should be, that should also be dorsiflexing or flexing at the ankle. And when that occurs, then the knee should be flexing and the hip should be flexing. And then we could also look at the pelvis. And when pronation occurs, we should see an anterior tilt to the pelvis where it's rolling on top of the femur head. And that will allow those glutes and those hamstrings to start to load. The flexion of the knee as it drives toward that big toe in pronation, because the ankle is internally rotating, sending that knee toward the big toe is going to excite the VMO. And now we got glute medius and VMO and glute max. All those muscles start to wake up because of pronation. And then in order for us to stay upright against gravity in the most efficient manner, as the pelvis is anteriorly tilting, the rib cage has to do just the opposite, and it needs a posterior tilt. So the shoulder blades or the shoulders are drawing back. And then the skull, in order to stay level with the horizon, has to do just the opposite of the ribs. So now we're looking at these bony structures of the pelvis, the ribs, and the skull, and how they move in opposition with one another, like cog wheels in a watch, that the teeth just turn one direction on one wheel, forcing the other wheel to turn the opposite. And if you can imagine those cog wheels being attached to muscles, one side's going to lengthen and load with tension, while the other one shortens up because those teeth are coming toward each other. That's what's occurring in pronation. And there's other things. That's the sagittal plane. In the frontal plane, we can see that the rear foot is going to evert or roll inward and have the bottom kind of roll outward. The forefoot is going to have to do the opposite of that, and the toes the opposite of that. So we even have cog wheels in the feet. And then up through the chain, we'll see that we've got adduction on that loaded side of the leg that's pronating, and the other side's dropping off because we don't have as much weight on it. So we start to see these kind of joint relationships, and if those are occurring at the right time, then we can say that not only the foot is pronating, but we have a pronated knee. And that knee is one that is going to be flexing and traveling medially toward the big toe. Now, if we look at actually the joint, not to get too deep into this, but that knee joint is actually externally rotating. And the killer is that when we look at anatomy books or biomechanic books, everyone's going to say, podiatrists included, that knee is internally rotating. But the trouble is that if it was internally rotating, the VMO would never turn on, and we wouldn't get the proper joint mechanics. The knee is actually externally rotating because the femur is traveling faster on top of that knee joint, creating that external rotation and that turn on of the VMO. So just that point there, we've been telling so many clients to drive their knee toward the second toe or toward the midfoot, or never let it travel over the forefoot. And in so doing, we're never training the proper mechanics in the joints. Therefore, the nerves never send the proper signals to the muscles to decelerate those actions. And that's probably why we have a lot of ACL tears in the world today.
Okay, so that's also a lot to unpack. And, really, I mean, you did go up the chain. So my question before we get on to more of the supination mechanics, I do want to ask you, like, before we get into this, how obviously you're looking at one piece at a time, because if the foot isn't doing what it's not supposed to do, there's no way we're going to be able to get to do what we're supposed to do at the knee, at the hip, etc. So how are you?
It could come from the bottom, and then or come from the top down. But you kind of look at it with a wide-angle lens that you can come in and close up on. So I might be looking at the foot, which is the only part of the body that hits the ground on a regular basis and starts kind of the chain reaction of movement up the chain. So that's pretty important to look at. But I might be just gazing back and looking at the whole global pattern and saying, boy, those hips aren't moving the way they should be moving right now. I wonder what that's all about.
How are you assessing video, or are you just like, right now, obviously you could probably do it naked eye, but how do you have trainers doing it? Are you like, okay, let's take a video of this, let's analyze it. What are you doing?
Actually, it's too complex, to be honest. I love geeking out and going into video gait analysis and freezing frame after frame at the different phases of gait cycle, find out what they're missing there. That's a really fun adventure for me. But in terms of like real time working with clients, I want to find out, okay, what is their pelvis doing? Is it anteriorly tilting or posteriorly tilting in a static posture assessment? Is one anteriorly tilted while the other one's posteriorly tilted? Do we have some incongruity there? And then I want to also find out dynamically, what is it like for them to tilt anteriorly or posteriorly? Is there an area that they struggle to achieve? And I'll do that, but also do a frontal plane assessment with the pelvis. Can they laterally tilt it, or what we call hiking one side and dropping the opposite? Or can they translate it? Can they just let them glide across like you're doing the bump, the dance of the bump? Can you just let it glide across without any kind of lateral tilting, but just shearing off to one side or another? And then how well does it rotate? So I'm looking at basically 4 movements of the pelvis: tilting, hiking, dropping, translating, and rotating. What are they missing? And then once I know what they're missing, that automatically tells me what kind of lunge, what kind of step up, what kind of squat, what kind of deadlift they may need to benefit from compared to everything else, as well as what kind of mobility drills will they be needing if they're having a hard time doing this particular movement. I move up, then I have 10 basic movements that I look at. 4 in the pelvis, 3 along the rib cage, and 3 in the shoulders. Can the rib cage tilt forward and backwards, anterior, posterior? Can it laterally tilt to the left and to the right on axis? And can it rotate to the left and right on axis? And where do they struggle? And I'll do the same thing: shoulder flexion, abduction, and internal-external rotation. That gives me a pretty good idea just from the get-go what's missing in their overall components. And really, Anthony, if you think about every single sport that humans participate in is really governed by how the body moves. It's not like we suddenly can just take our limbs apart and throw them across the field for some new sport. It's like it's all dictated how the body moves. And what is the most basic form of movement but gait? So I've been looking for this kind of methodology for a very long time now, because I kept scratching my head at how programs were being designed prior to this, and I'm realizing that it's really not based on the elements of simple human movement of gait, but it's more compartmentalized, or it's just based on aesthetics or whatever the case is.
So before I'll ask some more questions about that assessment, but I want to, like, while we're on this track and the pronation mechanics are in people's heads, let's talk about the supination mechanics.
All right. So with pronation, it was all about loading the tissue eccentrically, slowing everything down, as if you're taking a rubber band and you're drawing it back just before releasing it to send it across the room. When you release that rubber band, you begin supinating. That's essentially it. We've reached the end range that the joints are going to travel in pronation. We've reached the lengthened state that they're willing to go in, and they must do just the opposite. The joints must start to return more toward a central place or beyond. The muscles must go from a lengthened, loaded position to a shortened position. And that is what supination is. So in regards to the foot that was splaying out and the arches were dropping, now the arches are going to need to reform. So all that plantar tissue is now shortening in a very fast manner to create propulsion and momentum. That ankle that was flexed in a dorsiflex position is now plantar flexing. The knee that was flexed is now extending and internally rotating and locking into place to become a rigid lever, just like the foot is when the arches lock up. So we go from this mobile, adapted position to absorb impact in pronation to becoming this rigid propulsion system. The hip that was flexed is now extending. That pelvis that was hiked is now dropping to a more neutral position, and then beyond that, as we drive off that leg. The spine that was extending is now coming forward a little bit into a more neutral position. And the shoulders that were retracted back may find themselves coming forward into protraction. So these are the joint relationships that have been established for millions and millions of years here, at least tens of thousands if we think of like the real when humans truly evolved out of the mix of Australopithecus and the rest of them back there in that branch. But basic human motion, these joint relationships have maintained themselves for generation after generation. And you can get around them. There's plenty of ways, too. We see it all the time in regards to compensation, improper posture, and so on. But like Gray and Lee will say, that the further away you get from the ideal or from a centrated body, the the less potential you have, and the more work you have to do, the less efficient you are. So supination is all about the propelling off the ground, the rigid levers that can be created through bones locking into place against one another and allowing the force to propel through it. How was that?
It's pretty good. Yeah. It's again, you can see why we shy away from this. Like, no way, I'm not going to bother with this. This is crazy. No, it's a lot. It does sound like a lot. And I'm going to ask you in a couple minutes to summarize again. But what I wanted to ask you, you brought up FMS too. I feel like FMS will look at this movement from a more of a global perspective, and I feel like this is getting a little bit more specific. Can you just kind of talk about those two different ideas where they might say, well, you're moving this way, let's check your gait, where you're saying, let's look at the gait and posture, then let's look at some of these movements?
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it, I guess. Yeah, it depends on what perspective you're coming at. The FMS, Lee and Gray were the first ones to tell you, they developed that as a screening process for high school athletes to make sure they were ready to do some type of resistance training. It turned into something quite different over the last 20 years or so, that it's now being used as some kind of other assessment tool rather than a screening process. So with the FMS, which I used for many years and found great value in it, I just happened to find that it led me down into it. It allowed me to ask more questions than I realized I had. And so through answering those questions, I came upon gait. And honestly, I can see how gait filters over into almost every exercise in the gym, but non-traditional and traditional alike. For instance, let's just take a lunge. A lunge is an exaggerated form of gait. You're just taking a larger step and landing deeper on the ground. So we should see that the forward leg is presenting pronation, while the back leg that we're propelling off of should be presenting supination mechanics. And so I look at that through that filter, and I find that, well, most people are actually not supinating off the back leg. That knee is staying flexed. They can't extend through the hip. They're not truly supinating into that foot and creating a lever system. So what do we do about that? Well, we focus all our attention on the forward leg, but we don't put much attention on the back leg. Most people want them to drop that back knee down to the ground to get deeper into the forward leg, which is fine if that's what you really want to focus on, your attention on the forward leg. But if you're not focusing on both sides of the coin, then you're only training half the athlete as far as I'm concerned. So on many of the lunges, I'm going to encourage supination more on that back leg than the front leg. So yeah, the FMS definitely has had a place in my life, and it brought me to understanding joint mechanics. And I guess that's the basic difference there, is that I'm looking at joints and not what muscles are inhibited or facilitated. Because if I start going down the tracking what muscle's doing what, and I always come back to blaming the glute medius for all problems in the world, then I know I'm not really getting to the root cause of it. So without knowing what the bones are doing, how can you know what the muscle should do? And it's so much easier to look at one joint that's surrounded by dozens of muscles than to look at all the muscles themselves. So I want to see, is that hip properly executing pronation mechanics, and can it properly execute supination mechanics? And a step up is a great way of promoting supination. A forward lunge into that front leg is a great way to look at pronation. A deadlift is a great way to look at how do we load and come out of it. So we've got both the pronation and supination mechanics there. So if you start to put that kind of filter over all your movements in regards to how does this relate to gait, the world starts opening up to the amount of information the body is really giving you.
Yeah. So go back to that lunge that the lunge that you were talking about with, you wanted to encourage supination on the back leg. So instead of that knee going directly to the ground, what are you coaching for that back leg?
All right. Well, okay, we're going to kind of get into it here. But so when you're doing a lunge and you're trying to lunge off that back leg, there should be 2 points of contact on that foot. The heel's already rolled off, and we want to make sure that we have good contact on the outer portion of the forefoot, that fifth metatarsal head, as well as the first metatarsal head. As soon as I get somebody to press through there, they begin feeling their knee extend because it's an automatic kind of action, that joint relationship that's turned on. And so as soon as I can get them to press through there, I look to see what's going on through that knee. Can I get it to can I get it to extend and internally rotate? And then does that allow for that hip to open up? Now, most people are really gunked up in the hips in terms of the soft tissue. We spend too much time online, Zoom meetings these days, and so on. So that tissue is really quite locked up. So I'm not expecting really solid supination mechanics to begin with. And I'm probably going to find that hip is congested. It's not really wanting to extend. So they start to extend through their spine instead or somewhere else. So I'm just going to coach them. Can you experience that foot pressing through on those 2 points? Do you get a sense that knee is extending? Can you get more out of it? Can you extend through that hip? And suddenly things light up. Now, this is not a strength action so much as it is a kind of mobility, flexibility, just lengthening and learning exercise. If I want them to really explode through supination, then I'm going to put them into like a step up where I can see them loading onto it and driving off. The lunge itself is more like a kind of a mobility drill for supination. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally get it. As long as, like you just said, you kind of made sure like it wasn't just specifically for strength in the beginning. We got to dial it back and look at those mechanics first.
Exactly. Yeah. Can they own those movements? And if they can't own them, how can I encourage them to exist? Because if they don't exist, then if that foot isn't supinating, it's got to be doing something else. And there's only one other choice than staying in pronation. It's not actually getting into a supinated response. So therefore, it's not really propelling very much, and it's relying on other areas to do the job for it. And most of us are really poor at supinating to begin with. So it's really one of those critical movements that I really watch with a lot of people.
Excellent. Let's just take a step back now, just from saying, okay, Rock, you're gonna give us some homework right now. It's got to be some basic homework. It's day one of class on gait analysis. What are some things you're gonna say tonight when you go home? We're going to talk tomorrow, but I want you to go home and look at this. Is what you're going to learn a lot from just doing this. Look at this when somebody walks or when they're standing there.
Oh, beautiful. That's such a great question that no one's asked me. So here it is. Your homework is to explore your own body and what you're capable and incapable of achieving through these movements. And the 10 movements I'll list again. But what you really want to do is find out what your body is able to do. Because before you start coaching somebody else, if you don't really physically feel it in your frame, you're probably not going to see it somewhere else. In fact, what we find commonly is where you struggle with your movements, you're probably going to not see it in somebody else's movements because you just haven't experienced it. So here's the 10 movements that I would have people take home as homework, and get a little piece of paper off to the side with a pen. And what you're going to do is you're just going to write notes and observations about how your body moves. Standing with both feet underneath you in a comfortable posture, what is it like to anteriorly tilt your pelvis forward and then tilt it back? Can you do so and still maintain this vertical stacking of your body without your torso bowing forward or backwards, without the hips thrusting forward or back, but just simply what is it like to tilt your pelvis back and forth, and then make a note. Then, in that same stance, what is it like to glide your hips off to the right and off to the left? Can you do so and basically keep your head where it is and just allow your hips to sway over like a palm tree or something? And what is that like comparing left to right side? Do you feel as if you are more restricted going in one direction versus the other? What does it feel like? Do you feel like you're having to rotate in order to go sideways? Just be really observant and aware of your body. The next one would be bending into one knee in that standing position. Can you feel that hip drop on that side? Do you feel the other side stay where it is or hiking in the opposite direction? And then come back up, bend the other knee, and allow that hip to drop down. Can you do those in a clean manner? Where is it that you're restricted? Can you even establish anything like that motion, or does it feel completely foreign? Break out the thesaurus and use adjectives at will. I'm not looking for anything that is exact science here. I just want to get a feel for what your body is capable of doing. And then give yourself the same stance, keep your torso still, and turn your hips and belly button to the right and to the left. Is there one side that you can achieve more rotation than the other? And then also, how do you achieve that rotation? Is it by driving one hip forward, or is it by pulling one hip back, or is it a combination of both? And is it different from one side to the other? Get an understanding of actually how you rotate through the pelvis. And what most people are going to find is that it's not what they were thinking. Some people will realize they're only rotating with their left hip by driving forward or pulling back, and their right hip doesn't seem to be engaged at all. So those are the 4 pelvic motions. Then go up to the ribs and do similar movements. Anteriorly and posteriorly tilt the rib cage. So we're looking at extension of the spine and flexion of the spine. Can you do this while keeping the rib cage above the pelvis and not bowing forward or leaning back? Then the sternum being your axis point of rotation, as if there's an arrow directly through your body out the front and back. Can you tilt off to one side and then off to the other? Left and right lateral tilts. Can your pelvis without throwing your body from one side to the other? And what's the quality of movement like there? Does one achieve a greater degree or a cleaner way of moving compared to the other? And then rotate the rib cage left and right while keeping the hips still. Can you disassociate that movement and just feel what it's like to rotate? Are you pulling back with one shoulder or driving forward with another? How do you rotate? And then lastly, let's just look at the shoulders. Keeping your arms stiff or straight by your side, elbow straight, just bring it forward into shoulder flexion, overhead, as far as you feel comfortable. When do you feel the restriction? And you can do this several times, so you can say, well, I wasn't warmed up. So do it enough so you get a feel for it. Compare it to the other shoulder. Is there a difference? Then do arm abduction. So palm forward, arms by your side. Take one arm, reaching out and up and overhead with the elbow straight. What's the quality of arm abduction like? Side to side, make a note. And then internally and externally rotate both arms when they're dangled down by your side. Do you notice any difference? Is one able to be cleaner than the other? There's 10 movements that are going to give you a whole bunch of information about how your body moves. And the beautiful thing is all of those 10 movements are found somewhere in the Gait Cycle. These are elements of movement that you should own in your body. And as soon as you find out what's missing, you're realizing, wow, everyone in life limps. Everyone's limping in the world in some degree. They're just using unique strategies to get around the issues that they've experienced in their life in one way or another. And it's created these patterns of movement that we're finding now. And then once you find that information, then we can explore what exercises might benefit you.
Yeah, I love the way I really like this. First of all, this self-awareness, because it really does help when you go through it, number one. And I love the way it relates back to the gait. It also reminds me, I'm not sure how familiar you are with FRC or functional range conditioning. They talk about CARS. I don't know what the acronym is for, but right now off the top of my head, but they talk a lot about that. The CARS are really an exploration of this joint movement, and it'll tell you, okay, wait a minute, this feels a little off. And I know this sounds overwhelming, but I know if you did this, the more you do it, now you're starting to say, wait a minute, this wasn't here yesterday, or I didn't do this, or now this isn't feeling right. So it's a really interesting kind of self-exploration of your body.
Exactly. Honestly. And, you know, we're always adapting to our environment and every situation that we find ourselves in. It's not like we are static by any stretch of the imagination. So this is an ongoing assessment that we do with our clients and that we encourage them to do at home, because not only is it an assessment, but really what you're doing is you're stimulating movement in the joint capsules, you're stimulating the mechanoreceptors, you're stimulating lengthening and shortening of the tissue, you're really stimulating proper joint function and mechanics. So just by doing the assessment several times in the past, and even today, we'll have somebody do the assessment and suddenly they're walking around going, oh, wow, my shoulder isn't bothering me right now. But that lower back, oh my gosh, my lower back, I'm not even feeling my lower back right now. And it's not like we intentionally tried to deal with a symptom of pain or anything. It's just by getting the body to move in the proper way that it was designed to, then things have a way of just happening for it to benefit them. So yeah, it's very interesting because really it does seem complex, and yet it's really simple at the same time. All we have to do is look at what the joints do. And can we get the joints to do what they should normally do? And then the muscle tissue and the soft tissue surrounding it are going to have to go along with whatever the joint motion is. So for a while now, conventionally speaking, we have been taking mini bands and other kinds of tools and trying to activate a muscle that's been inhibited. Well, that's great, but you're dealing with 635 muscles that work in an integrative fashion. It's very difficult for me to believe that one muscle is the cause of all of it. Now, we can try and facilitate that muscle, wake it up, and suddenly you'll feel like, oh, yeah, that's better. But you haven't really trained the whole body to understand how the mechanics relate to the rest of the body. And so I see that as just a Band-Aid, a temporary fix, and not actually addressing the underlying cause of why somebody is choosing these movement patterns or compensatory actions the way they are. So the beautiful thing is by getting understanding of how the joints move, it kind of takes that away. You can realize, oh, well, let's just get that knee to properly move when it flexes. It's actually going out laterally when it should move more medially. What would happen if we got that knee to move medially? Well, the arches in the foot begin to drop. Oh, that hip begins to turn on. Oh, that glute begins to fire and that VMO begins to fire. And the next thing you know, just by moving the knee in the proper position when that person is doing whatever movement they were doing, things start to light up. And if it's more efficient, remembering that the brain is always trying to choose the most efficient means of movement, if it's provided with some stimuli that shows more efficiency, that brain's no dummy. It's just going to go, oh, let's do that more. And the next thing you know, you've just changed the pattern and they've gotten more powerful, more explosive. Their athletic prowess is through the roof. It's really something.
Excellent. So let me just, the Perform Better presentation you did, understanding gait and posture, you obviously you have an hour and 15 minutes on that. You go a little deeper and we could see is there some video and some other things that you go in that presentation, trying to get people to go when SAC comes out to go check this presentation out?
Yeah, I just spoke with Chris at Perform Better, and they're hoping by the end of September that the app will be out and we can see everyone's performance because, to be honest, I didn't see your performance either, but I would like to see your presentation for sure. And yeah, in the presentation, there were some slides, and I was able to be on the screen, so I did some of the basic assessments that I just laid out, those 10 kind of screens or movement experiences, and then also kind of overlaid it into the fact, okay, well, how do you apply this? It's great to know gait mechanics and everything else, and it's great information, but how does that help me in training clients? Well, if you've got somebody who struggles to rotate their pelvis to the right and they have no problem rotating it to the left, well, I already know that I want to have their left leg forward in some type of stances because that will encourage the pelvis to rotate to the right. So we can use these practical examples there as to how that can guide a conditioning program. And the other thing I spoke of in the presentation, and we don't have to get too deep into it, but conventionally speaking, with the programs that we've been designing, and the nice thing about Mike Boyle is that he's not afraid to make blanket statements like the parallel squat. He doesn't train anybody in the parallel squat. He's a lot more unilateral, which thank you for standing out there and saying that, because honestly, we are contralateral bipeds. We move with one leg doing the complete opposite action that the other leg's doing. And to do just continual sagittal plane bias bilateral movement for the majority of a conditioning program is just putting a gag order on how the joints should really move on a playing field or on a court or any kind of movement in real life. So that whole bilateral stuff is great as long as it reflects the person and specifically how much that person needs to be bilaterally strong and symmetrically. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that if we could do maybe 10 to 20% of our training in bilateral positions, great. But could we explore the other aspects of unilateral and contralateral movements the way that 80% of our day is actually transpiring? Does that make sense too?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Preaching to the choir here. So, and for the most part on the show, Rock, let's go into, obviously that was, we're kind of understanding now where you're coming from. I want to talk about, you talked about just even using the foam roller to help realign the body. So talk to us how you use that to start to figure or to solve some of these problems.
Sure. Happy to. So we got to speak about posture, right? We've got people a whole bunch of us in the field are now doing posture assessments, which is phenomenal. And now, what do you get out of the posture assessment? That's the question. Are you understanding the state of the muscle tissue that they're in when the posture is a certain position? For instance, let's consider like the teenage girl with an attitude. And that means that her arms are crossed and she's kind of leaning over one hip's higher than the other. You kind of get a sense of what that's like, right? So, yeah, because I've got a teenage daughter. It's really easy for me to visualize that one. But when one hip goes higher than the other, that means that hip is going, or the pelvis on that side is higher than the other side. Let's say the right pelvis is higher than the left. And that body is shifting over to that right side. That right hip is in a state of adduction. So the adductors are going to be shortened. And because the body is shifting over there, the adductors on the other leg are going to be lengthened. So by knowing where the body is in space in terms of posture, we can better establish the length relationship that the muscles have in that state. Now, with foam rolling, we've been using it for a long time. It's the cheapest form of massage we can get. And when thinking of massage therapy, the massage therapists or body workers will try and release muscles that are shortened to return them back to a more neutral, balanced length. And they'll try and take the lengthened muscles and shorten them, cross fiber friction or whatever they can use as a tool to draw them back into a shortened, more neutral length as well. So when the body gets out of alignment, that muscular imbalance, we're going to see muscles that are long under tension and others that are short and compressed. So knowing that and where their body is, we can start to target those areas that, for me, I target the compressed muscles, because typically the compressed muscles are the ones that are understimulated. They're not being loaded and lengthened with the weight of the body suspending on it. They're actually more shortened and not as facilitated or active, or however you'd like to term it. So by doing some just tactile sensation on it, we're going to stimulate it. So we hit the roll with that, but then we can roll back and forth along the muscle to try and lengthen it. So what I've done is I've just kind of made this illustration of bare feet on a piece of paper, and I'll have somebody stand in their bare feet and just get a sense of where their body's mass is traveling in regards to their feet. Do they feel more weight in the heels or in the forefeet? Do they feel more weight on one foot compared to the other? And depending upon where they're feeling their mass generally kind of migrate toward, there's an arrow on that piece of paper that goes in that direction, and there's a list of soft tissue based on how joints react with one another, and kind of an educated guess as to what muscle tissue might be shortened, and those are the ones they target. And so by targeting those shortened muscles and rolling them back and forth, stimulating them, lengthening, and then having them go and walk around and then check their posture, well, those muscle tension relationships have changed, and more often than not, their bodies are more centrated. And it's a great way to start a workout as well as finishing it off, because every workout's going to be pulling the body in all different sorts of directions. And most of the time, from the people I speak with, they do foam rolling just at the beginning as a warm-up, but it's fantastic to do as a restoration and a balancing effect as well.
So after the foam roll, you said, you'll get them to walk around. Are you targeting, so for example, if you're going to work on one specific shortened, the compressed, you're targeting the compressed muscles, are you going to focus on a movement specifically right after that that's going to maybe focus on getting that movement to be better, for example?
It's a great 1-2 punch. It's a fantastic way to do it. Let's take the hip flexor, because that's a very common place that everyone's attention has been for the last 10 to 20 years or so. The hip flexors, you got somebody with an anteriorly tilted pelvis. So those muscles are going to be shortened for the most part. Psoas, iliacus, whichever ones we're talking. Okay, so now we know with an anteriorly tilted pelvis, those muscles are in a shortened state. We're going to roll them out. We're going to try and stimulate them. Yes, it's going to be tender, so we don't have to go deep, but we're just going to get some length in there. And then what do I want to do? If the pelvis is anteriorly tilting and that therefore their hips are going to be in flexion, and I know that when my hip is in flexion, my knee should be in flexion. So I want to do the opposite. If I'm going to get some extension or some length out of that tissue, I want to gently try and bring the pelvis to a neutral position. So therefore, from an anterior to neutral is posteriorly tilting it. I don't have to take it into a full posterior tilt. I just want to bring it into a neutral position. So I have to posterior tilt that pelvis. I need to extend the hip. So therefore, the leg is going to be behind me. And I need to extend that knee. Oh, that's interesting. We're just talking about supination mechanics earlier with those same joint relationships. So if I'm going to roll out the hip flexor, I'm going to follow it up with something that encourages supination on that side to occur. And therein, it just kind of keeps rolling back and forth over it. All right, I can target a muscle, but how does that relate to what the joints are doing? And once I get those joint relationships established, I find myself in a gait pattern. So I might have that side going back into a forward lunge position with that leg being back. And I'm going to really work on opening up that area in all three planes of motion, and then have them walk around, see how that feels. I had one guy in here who's a very famous podcaster. He's a high jumper as well, and we did something similar to that. And the next thing you know, he's actually hopping around the studio trying to get air. He felt like, wow, I honestly have not felt this kind of movement since high school when I was high jumping. So it's really remarkable that we can affect the body so quickly and so long lasting, as long as we have the right tools and the understanding of how the body moves.
Rock, you and I talked earlier about this idea, and then this, not the danger, I think that's the wrong word, but this misconception that somebody's going to take away right now is Rocky doesn't do any strength training. We're going to be sitting in there for 2 months doing just some gait training and foam rolling. How quickly are you getting, because we know these changes can't happen. They can't stick. We got to keep going. It's about consistency. So how long before you're getting into some strength training?
It's such a funny question. Everybody keeps asking me. I love lifting heavy shit. I totally do. You just got to own the movements. And I use little foam wedges to give the foot a different shape, to propel better movement through the whole chain. But I get people lifting right away. I'm not going to get them doing bilateral deadlifts unless I really need those mechanics to occur. Same thing with the back squat. The back squat is a powerlifting exercise. It's a powerlifting lift. It's a competitive lift that we somehow think that this is what everyone must do. Well, everyone that's a power lifter should squat. The same thing with bench press and deadlift. That's where we got them from. And yet for 50 years now, we think that should be the bedrock of resistance training. If we look at martial arts or gymnastics, we're not going to see those type of movements. And yet we're going to see some incredibly athletic bodies promoting amazing, powerful moves. So to think that just because I'm not grabbing a barbell right away, that you're not going to see explosive athletes come out of my doors is kind of a fallacy you should break. But with that said, can I find the places that they're weak, and can I load into that? Now, it may not be loading with a 45-pound Olympic bar with plates on either side right away. That'd be like asking somebody to lay down on a bench, like grandma comes in, and I say, okay, Grammy, we're going to get in there. We're going to do 225 on the bench. I need you to rep it out. Like, no one in their right mind would ask them to do that. So if I could find a position that exposes a person's weakness, I'm going to load them with the proper intensity. And for many people, it's not going to involve anything but their own body weight. In fact, I might have to use a Gray Cook band or something like that to take some weight off of them and to actually provide some assistance so they can execute it properly. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to be building strength and creating hypertrophy or any of those other things that we do commonly with resistance training. But there's going to be other movements that they are quite proficient with. The joints are looking good. I'm going to start loading them up. If I got a crossover step up, I might try and work them with a walking lunge. Can you keep that back leg straight and extended? Can you show me supination? Let's load into it now. And it's going to be a proper progression. And I'm not going to necessarily just hand them barbells and dumbbells because that's what they're expecting. I'm going to have an educational process where I explain that you need to be able to extend through that hip before I load into it. Because if you can't extend through the hip and I just start loading into it, I'm just loading into your problems. And you might get stronger, but that knee is going to blow out or that lower back's going to give you problems. And I guarantee you're not going to be performing at the same level that you could be if we went in this route.
Yeah, absolutely. Rock, one more thing. Just in terms of your warm-up, it just made me think of this. In terms of your warm-up, are you going to try to reinforce, not from a specific example, I'm talking more of a general example, like you got your people to move a lot better, now they're training, like you said. Will you go into a warm-up just to kind of keep reinforcing some of these good pronation, supination mechanics in the warm-up?
Yeah, very much so. And then interspersed in between lifts as well. There's essentially, if we look at the gait cycle, we can break it up into separate phases over the course of, what each joint has to do. And there's marked points where joint mechanics are definitely different than just the moment before. So the moment the heel strikes the ground is one moment that the other leg should be shifting our weight forward toward that heel strike. So there's certain kind of body positions that you can get people into to try and just reinforce those mechanics. Also, when the toe comes down on the ground and we're suspending our weight on that forward leg while propelling off the back leg, there's specific movements that we can do to really encourage those joint mechanics. And then the cog wheel-like actions that we see in movement that create opposition, that creates muscle loading, we can start to do these cog-like positions that really get the muscles and the joints to experience what we need them to do. But I'll also throw in movement prep exercises based on the type of lifts that they're going to be doing for that workout. So it's kind of a blend, but there's definitely some great kind of, I will say neuromuscular or just nice kinematic sequencing that we can start to explore, because as soon as you do that, we're really just trying to train the brain. And we're trying to train the governing body that controls all the movements. And if we can give it what it really needs in an efficient way, then we're going to see the body start to perform things that, honestly, that it probably didn't realize it could do, because it's accessing these dark areas that it's been restricted for so long. And as soon as we start to include more of the body in the movements, the power production and athleticism just elevates so much more.
Absolutely. Well, you've convinced me once again to kind of really to explore this a little bit more, because it's definitely intriguing and I think it's super important, and it's really not really preaching to the choir, but again, talking about, getting, move well, move often. And this is one way to really move well. So Rocky, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this and making it really simplifying. I know it was a lot of stuff, but I feel like you did a great job simplifying it and really reinforcing that position. So thank you so much for coming on.
Truly a pleasure. I really appreciate the time you afforded me, and I hope somebody got something out of it. And I always love talking shop, so if anybody wants to reach out, I'm happy to talk.
All right, that's going to do it for episode 295 of the Strength Coach Podcast. Remember, you can try strengthcoach.com out for 30 days. Just $1. You'll have access to all the articles, videos, and programs, as well as the best forum on the net. It's the only place to have full access to Coach Boyle. He's on every day. To access that offer, go to strengthcoach.com, click the Join Now button to get started on your trial. Special thanks to Chris Pryor and the folks over at Perform Better. Right now, free shipping, orders over $49. Don't forget, the Perform Better app is coming out soon. All the recordings from the summer seminar series will be on there. There's a fall speaker series coming up, so stay tuned. Check it out at performbetter.com. Thanks to Coach Boyle and Rocky Snyder for sharing their insights and philosophies into the world of strength and conditioning, performance enhancement, gait, and posture. Thanks to Adam and Tim and TrainHeroic. Coach Boyle and I use TrainHeroic to deliver all of our online training. Head over to TrainHeroic.com to start your free 14-day trial. Thanks to Great Cook and Functional Movement Systems. Check them out at functionalmovement.com. My name's Anthony Renna. Check out my new book at BeLikeTheBest.com or ContinueFit.com. The book consists of 50 interviews with top fitness pros, and after each interview is a Be Like, which is an action step or a challenge that will help you be like the best. Check it out at ContinueFit.com or BeLikeTheBest.com. That's going to do it. Thanks again for listening, and I'll speak to you next time.